Brandon Ellis sat alone in his corner office on the 45th floor of Clearview Dynamics headquarters, surrounded by walls of glass and a panoramic skyline that once filled him with pride. For over 2 decades, he had poured everything into this company, growing it from a modest tech startup into a national powerhouse. Investors praised his vision, and media outlets celebrated his leadership. But on this rainy Thursday afternoon, none of the accolades brought him comfort. His eyes were fixed on a printed report lying on his desk, its contents more unsettling than any quarterly loss he'd ever encountered. The title read, Internal Workforce Satisfaction Review, Tier 3 Employees. But what it revealed was far more than just numbers. Brandon had always considered himself a leader who paid attention, a CEO who valued every rung of the company ladder. But as he flipped through page after page of the report, the truth became undeniable. Janitors were working double shifts with no overtime. Front desk staff had gone months without health insurance adjustments. Security guards, many of whom had been with the company for years, were still earning near minimum wage. Worse, anonymous comments from surveys painted a picture of workers who felt invisible, used unappreciated, and burned out. "We're not people here." One line read, "We're furniture." The phrase hit him harder than expected. What shocked Brandon most wasn't just the condition of these frontline workers, but how systematically overlooked they had become. The report clearly showed a widening gap between executive perks and employee well-being. Company events catered to the top 10%, private retreats, upgraded stock options, bonuses for meeting KPIs. Meanwhile, those who actually kept the buildings running were being told there simply wasn't room in the budget for raises, and yet profits had never looked better. Something didn't add up, and for the first time in years, Brandon couldn't dismiss the nagging guilt tightening in his chest. In the weeks prior, Brandon had brought up his concerns during leadership meetings, but each time the room grew quiet, one executive had shrugged and said, "They're hourly. Turnover's normal." Another added, "These aren't careers. Brandon, they're just jobs." Their indifference echoed in his mind now, like a warning bell. It wasn't that the leadership team didn't see the issues, they simply didn't care. These were the same people who'd helped him build the brand from the ground up, and now they sat behind glass doors, sipping catered coffee, while the people downstairs cleaned toilets with broken gloves. How had this happened under his watch? Brandon leaned back in his chair and stared out at the skyline, but all he could see was the disconnect between the company he thought he was running and the one described in that report. He had always said that Clearview Dynamics was built on people-first values, but what kind of culture had they really created? Were they any different from the corporations they once sought to disrupt? He knew the answer, and it sickened him. They had built something sleek, profitable, and scalable, but somewhere along the way they had lost their soul. That night, long after the last employee had gone home and the office lights had dimmed to save energy, Brandon remained seated. The report sat beside him, its pages covered in notes and underlines. But it wasn't enough to read about the problem. He needed to feel it, understand it, walk in the shoes of the very people his company had failed. No more filtered updates, no more PR-polished dashboards. If he wanted to rebuild Clearview into something human again, he had to see the truth for himself, not as a CEO, but as one of them. The decision had been made. Brandon Ellis, the man who once led high-level boardroom strategy sessions and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, was about to disappear from his own company. The next morning, his executive assistant helped him create a completely new identity. Jake Walker, a 42-year-old former administrative temp who had been laid off after his previous employer downsized. There would be no limo rides, no tailored suits, and no power lunches this time. This version of Brandon would be just another name in a stack of resumes, hoping to make ends meet in a job that offered little more than a paycheck and a badge. The New Jersey branch of Clearview Dynamics, just far enough from headquarters to avoid suspicion, had an open position for a part-time office assistant. It was perfect. He transformed himself in ways both subtle and significant. The sharp haircut he maintained religiously was allowed to grow out slightly, just enough to look untended. He let a patchy beard form along his jawline and swapped his custom wool suits for a $40 off-the-rack button-up and a pair of khakis that didn't quite fit. His shoes were cheap sneakers, scuffed intentionally to match the rest of his look. Gone was the leather briefcase. He now carried a worn canvas backpack with a broken zipper. Instead of being chauffeured, he took 2 buses and a train to get to the New Jersey branch, feeling every bump and delay like the thousands of employees who lived that same grind each day. For the first time in years, Brandon now. Jake blended into the crowd. On a rainy Monday morning, Jake Walker walked through the revolving doors of Clearview's satellite office with a quiet breath and a steady step. No one batted an eye. No one offered a handshake or a curious look. The receptionist barely acknowledged his arrival, handing him a visitor's badge and mumbling something about Training Room B before going back to her phone. He wasn't Brandon the visionary anymore. He was invisible, just another new hire in a sea of underpaid, overworked faces. And that, oddly enough, was exactly what he needed. This anonymity wasn't an insult. It was a window into a reality he had never truly understood. The training room was dimly lit and filled with cheap folding chairs arranged in crooked rows. About a dozen other new hires sat quietly, their expressions tired, their postures slouched. Some looked fresh out of community college. Others appeared middle-aged, weary from too many jobs and too few chances. The silence was heavy, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the soft hum of the overhead lights. No one made small talk. No one welcomed Jake. It was the kind of atmosphere that spoke volumes without saying a word. This wasn't a place of opportunity. It was survival. The trainer finally arrived 20 minutes late, offered no introductions, and handed out outdated manuals that looked like they hadn't been updated since the early 2010s. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and chaos. Jake was given a vague schedule, a desk with no chair and a computer that barely worked. He had to figure everything out on the fly, how to log into the system, where to get office supplies, which manager handled what. Whenever he asked for help, he was met with indifference or irritation. "That's not my department," someone said. "You'll figure it out," another muttered. Brandon had read about poor onboarding practices before, but this wasn't just poor. It was non-existent. He had designed systems meant to empower new employees, but here they were being tossed in like driftwood, expected to swim or sink without guidance. It was both eye-opening and heartbreaking. And yet the beauty of the experience came in moments of brutal honesty. When people assumed Jake was just another temp, they let their guards down. He heard the grumblings in the break room, the jokes about the suits upstairs, the resignation in voices that had once carried hope. He witnessed the subtle hierarchy, how executives were addressed with reverence while assistants were brushed aside. He watched how managers barked orders but never offered clarity. Jake was now living a truth that spreadsheets could never reveal. Every day he remained invisible. He gathered insights more valuable than any survey or performance report. And though no one saw him, Brandon was watching everything and remembering every detail. By his 3rd day at the New Jersey branch, Brandon, still wearing the name tag labeled Jake Walker, had already begun to see patterns that disturbed him. What had initially felt like disorganization now clearly resembled something more dangerous: intentional neglect. New hires like himself weren't given training schedules or mentorship. They were handed a vague list of duties and left to fend for themselves. There were no walkthroughs, no team introductions, and no real communication beyond what was absolutely necessary. He had once believed that every role, no matter how small, deserved clarity and support. But here, clarity was a luxury and support didn't exist. Jake was assigned to the front desk, handling everything from incoming calls to mail sorting and even stocking kitchen supplies. But the moment he asked a question, something simple like how to transfer a call or where to find printer paper, he was met with blank stares or condescending smirks. One co-worker, a man who had clearly been there longer, looked at him and said flatly, "Figure it out, rookie. No one holds hands around here." Another replied sarcastically, "You sure you applied to the right place?" The lack of collaboration was suffocating. Brandon had built Clearview Dynamics to be a space of growth, But from this vantage point, it was more like a cold assembly line. Managers floated through the halls like ghosts with clipboards. They didn't stop to check in or offer feedback. When one did speak, it was usually in a tone laced with impatience. One woman from logistics barked across the room. "Who left these files here without even bothering to find out who was responsible?" When Jake attempted to answer, thinking it was part of his task, she waved him off. "I wasn't talking to you." There was no respect in the air, just compliance. The office ran on silent fear, not purpose or pride, and the people who worked hardest to keep things moving were treated like background noise, their voices drowned beneath layers of managerial indifference. The most defining moment came late that afternoon. Jake was carrying a stack of mislabeled files to the main lobby when Craig Turner, a senior executive from corporate, entered the building. Brandon recognized him instantly, though he hadn't seen him in person in over a year. Turner, tall and impeccably dressed, exuded the kind of arrogance that came from a decade of unchecked authority. He marched up to the front desk and dropped a stack of reports onto the counter. "These go to accounting," he said. Without looking up, Jake, still unsure of the layout, asked quietly, "Could you point me to where accounting is?" Turner froze. The silence that followed was sharp. Turner looked up slowly, eyes narrowing as if trying to process the audacity of the question. "Are you serious?" He scoffed loud enough for others to hear. "This is why we don't hire temps with no real experience." He turned to the receptionist next to Jake. "Can someone get this guy out of my way and find someone who knows what they're doing?" Jake stood there, the words slicing through him, not because they hurt his pride, but because he suddenly understood this wasn't about him. This was normal. This was how entry-level employees were routinely treated, dismissed, belittled, and blamed for the cracks in a broken system. As Turner stormed off, Jake was left holding the files frozen in place. No one stepped in. No one questioned Turner's behavior. The receptionist kept typing as if nothing had happened, and that's when it hit Brandon harder than any line from the report he'd read in his office days ago. This wasn't just poor leadership. It was a culture that devalued those who worked the hardest, that allowed executives to belittle workers without consequence. And while he had once believed he was leading a company rooted in innovation and equality, he now saw clearly that Clearview Dynamics had developed a second face, one its founder had never meant to create, but one that had quietly taken over when no one was paying attention. Brandon's fourth day at the New Jersey branch began like the others, quiet, directionless, and slightly disheartening. He had just returned from delivering a misfiled envelope when he found himself standing in front of a jammed printer, an all-too-common occurrence in the office. A thick queue of documents was stuck in limbo, and no one nearby seemed interested in helping. He crouched down beside the machine, trying to make sense of the blinking red lights and the unintelligible error code on the screen. Behind him, people passed without so much as a glance, their eyes trained on screens or coffee cups. It was a scene that had repeated all week, chaos left to simmer, while the responsibility to fix it always landed on the least equipped shoulders. He let out a slow sigh and reached for the manual when a calm voice broke the silence behind him. "Hold up! Don't force it. You'll only make it worse." He turned to see a woman in a faded blue uniform, a cleaning cart by her side, moving with quiet confidence. Her name tag read, Linda Morales. She knelt beside him, pressed a few buttons with ease, and popped open the side panel. Within seconds, the jam cleared, and the machine began whirring back to life. She didn't ask questions or wait for thanks. She just fixed it. "That thing's been acting up for years," she muttered, wiping her hands on a cloth. Brandon looked at her genuinely surprised, not just by the ease with which she handled the situation, but by how invisible she'd been until that moment. Despite everything she clearly did for the office, no one had even acknowledged her presence. As they stood, Linda gave him a once-over. "You're new, right?" she asked, not unkindly. He nodded. "Jake," he replied. She offered a faint smile, then turned to grab her cart. "Follow me. You look lost." And just like that, she became his first real guide in this building of closed doors and cold stairs. As they walked, she pointed out key departments, shortcuts through the maze of hallways, and even which vending machines weren't rigged to eat your dollar. But it wasn't just her knowledge that impressed him, it was her tone. Calm, measured. Like someone who had learned the hard way not to expect help, but chose to give it anyway. Brandon started noticing her everywhere after that. While most employees stuck to their cubicles or lunch breaks, Linda moved like clockwork cleaning conference rooms before meetings started fixing coffee machines when they sputtered and redirecting lost clients, when receptionists were too preoccupied with their phones. She never raised her voice, never slowed down. And yet, despite her steady presence, no one seemed to see her. She'd refill the paper trays in copiers without being asked. She'd noticed the broken blinds in the break room and replaced them before anyone even filed a ticket. She was the unspoken glue holding the branch together, and still not one person said thank you. Curious and deeply unsettled, Brandon began doing some digging. Linda had been with Clearview Dynamics for over 10 years. In that time, she had received no promotions, no commendations, and only the most basic annual raises, each barely enough to keep up with inflation. Her job description listed janitorial maintenance, yet she was routinely called upon to help fix electronics, support new hires, and even manage deliveries. She had become the go-to problem solver, despite never being given any authority or formal acknowledgement. Her salary, he discovered with growing discomfort, was shockingly low, less than half of what junior office associates were earning after taxes and expenses. It was a miracle she was even able to support herself, and yet she never once complained. Not once. There was no bitterness in Linda's tone, only acceptance. She did what had to be done because it needed doing, not because anyone noticed or praised her. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and most employees rushed for the elevators, Brandon lingered near the cafeteria. There she was again, sweeping floors, wiping tables carefully, collecting untouched food and quietly slipping it into an old reusable bag. It wasn't part of her job. No one asked her to. But as she moved through the room like it belonged to her, treating every surface with care, Brandon felt something shift inside him. He had come undercover to witness the cracks in his company, but standing there in the dim fluorescent glow, he realized he wasn't just witnessing a flaw. He was watching the quiet strength of someone holding the entire building together, completely unseen. It was a Thursday night long after most of the lights had gone out, and the building's familiar buzz had faded into silence. Brandon, still in disguise as Jake Walker, had stayed behind under the pretense of finishing inventory tasks, but in truth he wanted to see how the office ran when no one was watching. That's when he saw her again. Linda Morales was in the cafeteria alone, methodically wiping down tables, stacking chairs and emptying trash bins. It was nearing 11 p.m., and yet she moved with the same quiet dedication she showed in the daytime. But something different happened that night. Something that caught Brandon off guard and stopped him cold in his tracks. He watched as Linda walked over to the counter where a tray of leftover sandwiches and boxed meals had been set aside, remnants from an earlier client lunch. Carefully, she began packing the food into plastic containers, stacking them with practiced efficiency, and sliding them into an old, faded grocery bag. At first, Brandon thought it might be a company policy saving food to reduce waste or store it for staff. But then he noticed how gently she folded the bag shut, how she tucked it into her tote like it was precious. She wasn't preparing it for tomorrow's shift. She was taking it home. She hadn't eaten a single bite herself. That moment pierced through Brandon with more force than any quarterly report ever could. There she was, this woman who held the branch together, who helped him without hesitation, who had never asked for a thing, packing up cold sandwiches, not for herself, but for someone else. He followed her from a distance after she clocked out. She boarded the late-night bus, sat quietly under the dim lights, and rode to a run-down neighborhood just outside the city. Brandon watched from across the street as she entered a worn apartment complex with cracked pavement and flickering hallway lights. Moments later, through a narrow window, he saw two children rush to greet her. Smiling, she handed them the bag and began dividing the food onto two plates. There was no third plate. Linda wasn't eating. She was giving it all to her boys. That night, Brandon barely slept. The image haunted him, the bag, the children, the absence of a plate for herself. It wasn't just about low pay anymore. It was about dignity. It was about a system that had convinced itself that people like Linda were lucky just to have jobs, while the truth was they were holding up the entire infrastructure of Clearview Dynamics. The next morning, he sat alone at a workstation in the supply room, logged into an internal HR system with credentials he'd kept from his executive past, and searched for Linda's profile. What he found stunned him. Her records were skeletal. No performance reviews, no salary advancements beyond standard cost of living bumps, no bonuses, no notes of recognition. Just a start date from over 10 years ago and a salary that hadn't moved meaningfully in a decade. Brandon stared at the screen, jaw clenched, heart heavy. The numbers didn't lie. Her yearly income wouldn't even cover a single executive team-building retreat. And while corporate staff debated catered lunches and upgraded equipment, Linda was taking home cafeteria scraps to feed her kids. It was more than oversight. It was cruelty, disguised as indifference. This wasn't one manager's failure or a single department's blind spot. It was systemic, cultural, woven into the DNA of a company that had slowly, quietly stopped caring about the people on whom it relied the most for all the talk of innovation and inclusion. Clearview had become a place where value was measured by title and visibility, where the quiet contributors were forgotten. And in that moment, Brandon made a promise, not just to Linda, but to everyone like her. He hadn't gone undercover to shame people or play a game of corporate drama. He had come searching for truth, and now that he had found it, there was no going back. He would fix this personally, publicly, and permanently. He closed the file, stepped out of the room, and took a long look at the office floor, humming with morning energy. He saw the cracks in the foundation, but more importantly, he now knew who had been holding the structure together all along, and he was ready to act not as Jake the Temp, but as Brandon Ellis, the man who built this company, and now had to rebuild it the right way. The day had finally come. Brandon Ellis stepped off the elevator into the executive wing of Clearview Dynamics, wearing a suit, not the scuffed sneakers and discount khakis of Jake Walker, but a tailored navy ensemble that fit like a second skin. His tie was tight, his jaw tighter. The polished reflection in the elevator doors showed the familiar version of himself, CEO, founder, leader. But something fundamental had shifted within him. This wasn't the Brandon who built empires with spreadsheets and investor pitches. This was the man who had scrubbed out coffee stains at 10 p.m., been humiliated for asking directions, and watched a mother skip meals for her children. The air in the hallway was charged. Everyone had received the urgent meeting invite, executives, department heads, senior staff. No context, no agenda. Just one word required. As Brandon entered the conference room, conversation died mid-sentence. The chatter dissolved into silence, replaced by stiff backs and stolen glances. Around the enormous glass table sat the highest-ranking leaders in the company, people who had grown comfortable in leather chairs and marble break rooms. Near the back stood Craig Turner, sipping his usual black coffee, brows slightly raised with mild annoyance. "Brandon," he said, nodding slowly. "We weren't expecting you." Brandon didn't respond. He walked to the head of the table, placed a thick folder beside him, and looked each person in the eye. "Let's begin," he said. "There's something you all need to hear." What followed was a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the room inward. "I've spent the last 2 weeks working undercover in our New Jersey branch," Brandon said calmly. "Not as your CEO, not as a consultant, as an entry-level office assistant named Jake Walker." The effect was immediate. Some gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. Craig blinked, then smirked clearly. "Thinking it was a stunt," I've answered. "Phones, restocked supplies been barked at by supervisors and left entirely untrained by the systems we supposedly rely on." Brandon's voice was even, but every word struck like a gavel. I was ignored, insulted, and treated like a burden. But none of that compares to what I witnessed in others. People who keep this company standing, yet have been left behind. He opened the folder, pulling out a single sheet. "Let me tell you about Linda Morales." He said she's a janitor who's been with us for over 10 years. In that time, she has fixed broken machines, trained new employees, guided lost clients, and cleaned your messes often without being asked. She's done the work of 3 departments and never once complained. Brandon paused, and she's paid so little that she has to take leftover food home at night, just to feed her children. Murmurs broke across the table. Craig raised a brow but said nothing. Brandon continued. She's never received a performance review. No bonus, no recognition. While some of us debate what restaurant to cater lunch from, she doesn't have enough to eat. He held up a second paper, her salary history. This is how we've repaid her loyalty. The room was silent, weighed down by shame, defensiveness, and a dawning realization that none of this could be brushed off anymore. "This ends today," Brandon said firmly. "Effective, immediately. We are rolling out new policy changes across the company." He handed a document to his assistant, who began distributing it down the table. "First, we're increasing base pay for all frontline employees. No one working full-time at Clearview should struggle to afford groceries or rent. Second, we are extending full healthcare benefits and paid sick leave to every employee, regardless of position. Third, all new hires will receive structured training. No more being thrown into the fire with no support. Fourth, we are creating clear promotion pathways, because hard work at every level should lead to opportunity. And lastly," he said, his voice lowering, "every senior executive, including myself, will be required to spend 1 week each year working in a frontline role, janitorial reception, customer support delivery. You will walk the halls you manage. You will see the break rooms you overlook. You will stand where Linda stands." Several executives sat frozen, their mouths slightly open. Others leaned back clearly. Uncomfortable, Craig folded his arms and muttered, "With all due respect, we're executives, not interns." Brandon turned to him, eyes sharp. "If that's how you see it, Craig, perhaps you've been sitting in your office too long." He leaned forward. "Anyone here who has a problem with these changes is free to leave. But understand this, you will earn your place at Clearview, just like everyone else." The Monday after the meeting, before the office lights flickered fully on, and before the cafeteria even opened for breakfast, Brandon Ellis was already there waiting. He stood by the coffee machine in the break room, dressed not as Jake Walker, nor as the CEO in his boardroom best, but as something in between, relaxed, focused, present. In his hand was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. When Linda Morales entered, her shoulders tensed immediately. She gave a nod, polite but cautious, as if expecting to be told she'd done something wrong. Brandon turned, offered a warm smile, and simply said, "Linda." Her eyes narrowed with curiosity. "Yes, sir," she asked. He shook his head gently. "Brandon," he corrected, "I think we can drop the 'sir' today." He handed her the envelope without ceremony. Inside was an official letter of promotion. Effective. Immediately, she was now facilities manager of the entire New Jersey branch. Along with the new title came a full benefits package, a 45% raise, and a retroactive bonus for every year she had been overlooked. As she read the words in quiet disbelief, her hands trembled slightly. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Brandon smiled, his voice low and steady. "You've already said enough over the years, through every action no one recognized." Linda blinked fast, then nodded slowly. She didn't burst into tears. She didn't break down. Instead, she breathed a long, deep breath, like someone coming up for air after a decade underwater. The news of her promotion spread quickly. Whispers of "Did you hear?" filled the office halls, not with gossip, but with a sense of possibility. For the first time, people at the lowest rungs of the ladder felt seen. And it wasn't just Linda. Brandon's announced reforms began rolling out across Clearview Dynamics. Frontline workers, from custodians to receptionists, mailroom clerks to cafeteria staff, saw tangible changes in their paychecks and health coverage. Mandatory training programs were launched to equip new hires with the tools and guidance they deserved. Most importantly, a culture of gratitude began replacing one of neglect. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but the change was undeniable. The silence that once filled break rooms was slowly replaced with cautious optimism, and not everyone welcomed it. Craig Turner, red-faced and indignant, called the reforms a distraction from real strategy. He barged into Brandon's office one afternoon, hurling accusations of overreach and pandering. Brandon didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, looked Craig in the eyes, and said, "You're either helping us build the future or you're standing in its way." Craig scoffed. "I've been here longer than most of your new hires." Brandon's reply was instant. "And some of them have done more for this company in 1 week than you have in 5 years. That was the end of it. Craig cleaned out his office by Friday. Others who shared his mindset quietly followed, replaced by leaders willing to roll up their sleeves and step onto the front lines, literally. With every departure came a vacancy, filled by someone who understood what leadership truly meant: presence, empathy, and accountability. Linda, now in her new role, began hosting orientation walkthroughs herself. She introduced new hires with kindness, showed them where supplies were stored, and explained who to turn to for help, not because it was in the manual, but because no one had ever done it for her. The very person once treated as invisible was now shaping how others began their journeys. And in that shift, something extraordinary began to take root, not just policy change, but cultural repair. Dignity became part of the company's language. Brandon would sometimes stand in the back of a meeting room or linger near the front desk, observing the small things: a thank you from a manager, an offer of help from a veteran employee to a newcomer, a moment of laughter in the break room. They were subtle signs, but to him they meant everything. The reckoning had come. And now, the healing had begun. And it started with the most uncelebrated woman in the building, finally given the space, the voice, and the respect she had always deserved. For the first time in years, Clearview Dynamics wasn't just running efficiently, it was moving forward with heart. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable company-wide meeting, the day Brandon Ellis laid bare the truth behind Clearview Dynamics and the culture it had unknowingly built. The transformation since then hadn't come overnight, but it had come slowly at first, like the thaw of early spring, then steadily like the sun breaking through after a long winter. In departments where silence once reigned, voices now emerged. Employees who used to walk the halls with eyes cast downward now looked up, greeting one another with names instead of titles. New staff entered the company with training, mentorship, and a sense of direction. Most importantly, they entered with hope, the kind of hope that comes when dignity isn't just promised, it's practiced. Across every Clearview branch, reforms turned into rhythms. Pay increases were no longer seen as rewards, but as acknowledgements of effort. Health benefits became standard, not selective. Managers who once hid behind metrics now showed up in break rooms listening. And once a year, without exception, every executive, including Brandon, left their corner offices and reported to the floor. Some ran front desks, others joined maintenance teams, delivered shipments, answered customer emails, or swept warehouse aisles. There were no press releases, no photographers, just sleeves rolled up and humility worn openly. For many, those 7 days became the most challenging and the most transformative of their careers. It wasn't about checking a box, it was about rebalancing the scale. Executives who once scoffed at the idea of frontline immersion now returned from their weeks with quiet reflection and changed priorities. They understood what it meant to be interrupted in the middle of a task, to fix a jammed printer, to be thanked or not thanked for something mundane yet necessary. They learned the names of janitors, heard the stories of cafeteria staff, and sat beside call center reps, navigating impossible customer demands. Some apologized, some cried, and almost all of them emerged with a new lens, one that no chart or dashboard could ever provide. The line between leadership and labor had blurred, not in authority, but in empathy. And in that shift, Clearview found something it didn't know it was missing: its soul. Linda Morales, now comfortably settled into her role as facilities manager, became more than a story. She became a symbol. Her office, modest but filled with life, bore signs of her new reality: a plaque with her name, a fresh coat of paint, two framed drawings from her sons, and a whiteboard where she wrote notes of encouragement to her team. Under her leadership, turnover in support roles dropped to record lows. She implemented training systems rooted in compassion ones she wished she had received herself. New hires didn't just get a task list, they got a mentor. When Brandon visited her floor, she would greet him the same way every time, still remembering where the cleaning supplies are, and they would both smile, an inside joke now layered with mutual respect. Brandon's own office had changed too. Gone were the minimalist art pieces and glass awards that once filled the shelves. In their place stood photographs not of board meetings or product launches, but of people. A security guard laughing with a VP, a mailroom clerk being congratulated on 10 years of service, a receptionist training a senior manager during his immersion week, and at the center of his desk sat one photo in particular. Linda standing beside her sons, smiling under the Clearview logo. It wasn't a PR shot. It had been taken candidly on a quiet Friday afternoon after she had completed a training session for the new facilities crew. She hadn't known it was being taken, and maybe that's why it mattered so much. It captured everything Clearview had become. On some nights when the office emptied out and the city below lit up with that familiar New York glow, Brandon would stand by the window and think about how close they had come to losing it all. Not money, not market share, but meaning. He thought about the reports he had once skimmed, the meetings where he hadn't pushed back hard enough, the names of employees he'd never bothered to learn. And then he thought about what they had built in the aftermath. Not just a company, not just a culture, but a commitment to never again mistake silence for satisfaction, to never again let the quiet heroes go unseen. And in that quiet moment, overlooking the city, he once ruled from above, Brandon Ellis finally felt something deeper than pride. He felt peace. If this story moved you, we invite you to be part of something deeper. At Deep Inside HQ, we share real emotional and thought-provoking stories that reveal the unseen struggles and triumphs behind everyday lives. If you believe in a world where empathy drives change and voices from every level deserve to be heard, subscribe to our channel. Like the video, leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Let's continue building a community that doesn't just watch, but listens, feels, and acts.